So season one has just started, and I've spent the last 2 days kind of testing out all the builds I possibly could. I've not been able to test out all of them, but I got a good idea for a lot of different classes and which ones are going to be pretty solid for your initial starter build going into season one, the one that you should pick as you begin to farm. Before we dive into that, though, I have an amazing sponsorship for you all today for a Diablo 4 themed PC. With the start of season one and with the help of Skytech Gaming, Intel, and Signal RGB, I'm excited to bring you all a chance to win this Diablo themed PC. It has a 13th gen Intel 13600K and an RTX 4070. And because Signal RGB is a leader in RGB software, it actually has potions on the PC that react to your in-game resources. You definitely don't want to miss this well-designed, high-tech, and extremely unique PC from Skytech Gaming and Signal RGB. And if you want a chance to learn more or to win, click on the link in the description down below to help you blast this season one. And thanks Signal RGB for sponsoring this video. Now, as I mentioned earlier on in the video, we're rating these starter builds, meaning that we're considering how easy are they to put together? Do they require a ton of investment? How good are they at speed leveling? How good are they at speed farming gear, etc.? We're not really considering, okay, are you going to use like max DPS? Are you going to be able to like push really, really high, etc.? I'm really focused on like world tier 4 speed farming and then like your nightmare dungeons anywhere from like, equivalent level to like 10 levels above. The higher you can go, obviously, the better the build is if you could speed clear it. And I've divided it up all into the different classes, so there'll be timestamps. I have picked the 5 most popular / best, typically, builds that I have seen for each class. So we have quite the list here. And we're going to start off with the Rogue, because it's the one I have the most experience with and the one I personally am playing season 1. So we're going to start off with Twisting Blades, and it's actually going to be one of the only S tier builds for speed clearing. Twisting Blades didn't really get a whole bunch of nerfs come the season 1 patch. It did get a lot of nerfs in the past, but it was still one of the best builds, if not the best build. And with season 1, the only reason that it's going to like be and feel a lot weaker is because of the global nerfs and of course the passive nerf on it. And well, it's still extremely fast. You have a couple mobility skills, you're going to do insane damage, and your survivability is decent. It's one of the lower survivability builds, but because of your mobility and your high DPS, you typically make up for that. And because we're speed clearing, well, those two things are generally going to be a little bit more important unless your survivability is so low that you can't survive at all. Next build, we're actually going to have Rapid Fire. Rapid Fire, I'm going to say for speed clearing, probably a C tier build. I might adjust this at the end, by the way, but starting out here, I think I'm going to put it in C tier. It's an average build. It's not particularly great. It's not particularly bad. Problem with Rapid Fire is now without the siphoning strikes as consistent, you lose a lot more survivability that you really need on something like Rapid Fire because you generally are playing that close battle. But more importantly than that, actually, your DPS is just way lower and your AoE potential way lower as well. And those two things are pretty important for speed clearing. Next up, we have Barrage, and Barrage is actually going to go into A tier. I've really enjoyed this build. I found it to be extremely powerful and honestly, really not too many complaints. It's got a lot of mobility skills, as do all of the rogue builds, but actually the DPS is very good. And once again, you play it as a shotgun melee build, so the AoE on it's actually very good, while also the single target damage is very good, especially when you run something like Shadow Imbuement with it. Next up is Flurry. And I think I'm going to put Flurry into B tier. Flurry is like in the upgraded version of the speed farming of Rapid Fire. Flurry, generally, you're going to be running Flurry plus Rapid Fire for single target damage and the AoE potential. Or you could just go all in on Flurry, which actually I prefer to go all in on Flurry for speed clearing. And the main reason for that is, well, you're going to be going for a lot of just damage, AoE damage in particular, when you're speed clearing. And if you don't have consistent AoE damage while also having the ability to knock out those elites, then you're going to struggle. And so, yeah, in some scenarios, when you're pushing up, rapid fire plus flurry can actually be better because rapid fire is going to deal with those elites. But as long as you have the damage to AoE clear with flurry, the elites at least, it's actually a pretty fast build, but it does fall off quite a bit as you start to scale up, whereas something like Barrage or Twisting Blades doesn't do nearly as much. Next is Death Trap. I'm going to put Death Trap or the Trapper Rogue, usually in combination with Twisting Blades, at the A tier. Okay, it's very strong and something that I personally have found to be exceptionally good at speed clearing in particular. The AoE grouping up aspect is really nice, and overall the damage is really nice on this build as well as the CC potential allows you to stay alive a little bit better than some of the other builds on the list. Rogue is a high contender for speed clearing in this game. The problem is when you start to push endgame, you start to fall off significantly. But for speed clearing, it is definitely one of the better classes, I'd say, as I've started to dive in and fix a few of the problems that we might have had from the patch. So I initially thought it was going to be a lot more difficult, but actually Rogue ends up being pretty good. Let's dive into the Sorcerer next. So starting out with the Sorcerer, one of the most easy builds, or the easiest to set up builds, is actually Arclash. Why? Well, because the name of the build is actually based around a basic skill, which means that you don't really need a lot of investment for it to shine. And for that reason, I'm going to put it in B tier starting out here. I think the build is actually pretty solid and something that's going to be pretty easily obtainable while also being a solid, a little bit above average build, and will let you clear tier 4 pretty nicely as an initial starter build. As we develop the list a little bit, it might be a little bit lower, like high C tier, but I certainly think it's better than Rapid Fire, and it may even be better than Flurry, although I think Flurry has better potential than Arclash. Blizzard. I think Blizzard Sorcerer here is pretty solid. It's not insane, but its AoE potential is very good, and the damage is pretty solid as well. The key with a lot of the frozen builds on Sorcerer and Sorcerer in general is CCing is very, very important. And because you're speed clearing, you're generally going to be fighting characters that can be CC'd, and that's where Blizzard truly starts to shine, where you're able to blast down with a lot of different extra multipliers because you're CCing them. Blizzard ended up being quite a solid build, actually, and a little bit better than I thought initially it would be. Firewall. Whew, this one's tough. It's actually a solid build, and it actually got buffed in the recent patch, but well, it got buffed some parts, but overall it got worse. But I'm gonna have to put Firewall in C tier. The problem with it and speed clearing is that you don't speed clear because it's a burn effect, and generally speaking, when you're trying to clear quickly, you want burst damage and to one shot move on to the next pack. Firewall has a really hard time doing that, and so it's going to end up in the C tier as kind of your average, just okay build, but not anything that you're going to really be excited about. One thing that I will say about Firewall over a lot of the other builds on this list, though, is that the survivability aspect of Firewall is very high for being a sorcerer, and just in general, it's actually very high. So if you're struggling to survive and you might just want to take it a little bit slower, Firewall might be a good option for you. Ice Shards. This build's actually going to go to the top of A tier. I don't think it competes on the level of Twisting Blades, but I do think that it is a very, very excellent option to speed clear, and the best option that the Sorcerer has. Despite the heavy nerfs to Sorcerer, Ice Shards still is going to be one of the better farming builds in the game. And I think it goes a little bit higher, potentially, than Death Trap. You could argue that Death Trap is actually a little bit better than Ice Shards, and I would see that argument because you did get heavy nerfs from the Ice Shards with the critical damage increase, and oftentimes this was a perma-crit build. Ooh, now that I'm saying it, I'm talking myself into it being behind Death Trap. But yeah, Ice Shards is still a very solid build. It still does a lot of damage, and it still is a overall well-rounded option for the Sorcerer. Lastly, we have Chain Lightning. I think Chain Lightning ends up being slightly better than Arclash, and I would put it in B tier here. It ends up being quite solid, and now that I'm putting Chain Lightning there, I think we drop Blizzard down and Arclash down and leave it there for the time being, because yeah, I do think that Ice Shards is good, and I think Blizzard is noticeably worse than it. And Chain Lightning is better than Arc Lash. And although Arc Lash is a solid option, very easy to transition, it doesn't really perform too well for very long. And neither does Chain Lightning, to be fair. But yeah, it's a solid build. It's just not anything particularly special. It did get a little bit better in terms of the build compared to the other options in the recent patch. But yeah, not a huge fan of Chain Lightning. Ice Shards is definitely the best option that Sorcerer has. And Blizzard is a close second. But I shouldn't say close second. It is a second. That's why it's in B tier. So with that said, let's move on to the Necromancer here. So with the Necro, you'll notice that there are very hit or miss builds. Necromancer needed a lot of help with this recent Season 1 patch, and they did not get it. And in fact, they got a lot of nerfs as well to their strongest build, although I think it's still very, very strong compared to a lot of other options that you have on this list. With that being said, though, let's talk about Sever, a pretty weak build, I'd say, coming out from the Necromancer. You could argue it's a little bit better or a little bit worse than Arc Lash, but I think it actually performed a little bit better than Arc Lash. You have some very nice AoE potential with Sever, and that's one key component for speed clearing, and also you have a decent amount of AoE in order for you to kind of deal with a lot of the groups, which is nice. And of course, you have some options to use like Bone Storm and some curses if you wish. But overall, I found it to be just an average, okay, usable option when starting out for speed clearing. Bloodlance. Oof, guys, this is our D tier build so far. This is noticeably worse than a lot of things on this list. The AoE potential for this build got better, but it was atrocious, and it's still not good. Damage is not very high. AoE is not very high. You just don't have many options for speed clearing. I'm a huge I guess disliker, hater of Bloodlance. I do not like this build. I find it to be very mediocre, and it just doesn't do enough compared to a lot of the other options that Necromancer have. Speaking of which, the Shadow Infinite Blood Mist build, I find this to be really excellent, actually. And I'm going to put it at A tier. And the main reason for this is because survivability dropped so significantly, having the ability to basically be permanently survivable and just not taking any damage is actually really strong starting out for Season 4. Only problem is you do need a couple of pieces to make sure that this build is actually working, because your goal is to be basically infinitely blood misting, right? That's kind of the purpose of Infinite Mist, but it's a very solid build, and I've actually really enjoyed playing it. It's very simple, and it performs well. So AoE damage, pretty good, and survivability, excellent compared to a lot of the other options that you have on the Necromancer. Bone Spear, people have been waiting for this build, and my opinions on it. A tier, top of A tier, still good. I don't think it competes with Twisting Blades, though. One thing that's really, really quite different between Twisting Blades and Bone Spear is Bone Spear is high damage, similar to Twisting Blades, but very, very low mobility. And to be honest, your damage could be extremely high, way, way high, but you're only going to be able to push so far before you start getting one shot, and it lowers your speed clearing anyways. However, one really nice way to consistently get faster times is if you have the damage, but also have the ability to dash multiple screens within a few seconds. And the Rogue has that, and unfortunately the Necromancer does not. And so to me, it doesn't quite break into the S tier category, but it's still very, very good and does quite a bit of damage, even despite the massive critical strike damage nerfs for Bone Spear, and of course like the ossified passive and a lot of the options, not ossified passive, it was the aspects that go along the corpse tendrils aspect and the is it the splintering aspect, the one that gives you vulnerable. It's just so much worse now compared to what it was before. It's so much worse. Next one up is Summoner, and Summoner Necro is going to go in D tier as well. It is better than Bloodlance, but not by much. It ends up being pretty mediocre if you're running a pure Summoner build for speed clearing. If you're running a single target damaging build, it would probably be, B tier. Not bad, actually. But unfortunately, with speed clearing, it just does not do what you want out of it. And the minions get all messed up. It doesn't have very good AoE clear, AoE damage. You can do some options, like do some Thorns Summoner options, which can be okay. But even then, I found it to be pretty weak compared to things like Sever even, or Bone Spear, which are way better options for you on the Necromancer. Let's dive into the Barbarian. So diving into the Barbarian, this is a class that actually got hit quite a bit harder over the course of time, because what I didn't realize with the Barbarian is there were actually far more bugs plaguing the class than was initially kind of thought. And so when they fixed the bugs, and I put bugs in quotations because I've seen a lot of people complaining that they aren't bugs, and if they, were kind of core to the skills. But that being said, the builds are just a lot weaker. That doesn't mean that they don't have stronger builds to farm. They do. And we'll start off with one that's not particularly amazing, but decent. And that is going to be Thorn's Barb. So Thorn's Barb ended up average B tier. It provides a lot of thorns, and the nice thing with Thorn's Barb is that it's pretty survivable with the options to increase your damage reduction, your life, etc., but also the ability to just have monsters hit you and kill themselves essentially in game. And Thorn's Barb does a really good job at that. And what's nice is it also clears off stragglers, which some of these builds have a struggling time to do, or struggle to do, and therefore you can get a little bit extra speed clearing value from Thorn's Barb. Double swing, D tier. Not a good build for speed clearing. It's just not good. it's mainly for small area of effect, single target, mainly DPS, and unfortunately that's not what you want out of your speed clearing build. It's decent for pushing a little bit higher on the Nightmare Dungeon tier, but unfortunately it just clears so slowly that it's definitely not a build you want to start with for season 4. Hammer of the Ancients, quite solid. I'm gonna put top of B tier. I think Hammer of the Ancients is good still, and a build that you could absolutely run for the speed clearing as your first build into season 4. However, it did get a significant nerf or bug fix, depending on how you want to phrase it, but the damage on it is so much lower now compared to what you were experiencing. So don't go in and expect you to one-shot everything, because that's not what's going to happen. But it will kill groups of enemies pretty quickly with its strong AoE crit potential. Upheaval got quite a bit better actually with this recent patch, but unfortunately it's still not that great. And actually, I'm gonna put it right behind Sever. It's got decent AoE actually. It has a lot more potential than you might have initially thought, but it's not good. It's just average. It's decent. Something that you can get to work for your season 4 clearing, but or season 1 clearing, but you really should probably just go with a better option, because the damage and the kind of like cycling back over to Upheaval is a little too slow for my liking compared to the other two options, which is Hoda and Whirlwind. Whirlwind's still very, very good, and for speed clearing, I'm gonna have to say it jumps up ahead of Ice Shards and Death Trap still. Whirlwind's not what it was, okay? It's not even close to what it was. Not even close. However, all the builds are not even close to what they were. And because Whirlwind's very easy to put together compared to the other builds on the list, most of them, and also the ease of just running through enemies and clearing them, if you're able to survive, then you're just clearing so much quicker than oftentimes you will see a lot of other classes do so with, things like even Barrage, Infinimists. You could argue that Death Trap or maybe even Ice Shards, like these three builds, I think are pretty comparable in power level. But Whirlwind ends up being quite solid, and I'm gonna put it behind Death Trap actually. I think Rogue ends up taking the cake just a little bit because of the AoE potential with that Death Trap build, but also the mobility, which although the Whirlwind does actually have some, it doesn't quite clear as quickly as Death Trap in my experience. That's gonna be the Barbarian. Let's dive into the last class, the Druid. So with the Druid here, we have a lot of options to talk about that are actually quite solid, and I think that they probably are the second best speed clear compared to the Rogue. And starting off with the Tornado Druid, I'm actually gonna have to put this right behind Blizzard, a little bit ahead of Flurry. It does way more damage and actually has a lot more mobility than you might think. It kind of keeps up with the Rogue in some scenarios because of the DPS and the ability to just move quickly. Problem with tornadoes specifically is that for speed clearing, your goal is to throw the tornadoes onto the enemies, and they have sometimes some travel distance. You can't just one shot move on, one shot move on, and that ends up being a little awkward sometimes for the tornado druid, but still quite solid. And that leads me to Pulverized Druid. I want to put Pulverized Druid actually the top of B tier right now. And the main reason for this is actually you're going to find that the ability to kind of one tap people and just slam and move on, which you can actually do with the Pulverize, or just in general, just constantly AoE, is really, really solid for speed clearing in particular. The key with a lot of these things is you want to have the single target damage to either 1, 2, or 3 shot elites, and then you want to be able to basically one shot entire groups at a time. And builds like Blizzard, Hoda, Pulverize all do that. Or you can have things like Twisting Blades, which basically one shots elites, and then you can pull the Twisting Blades through other enemies while traveling and things like that. It's ridiculous. But Pulverize does a pretty nice job of just AoE clearing, and ends up in the B tier for me. Trample Slide. I think Trample Slide's actually quite good as well. It's kind of hard because I think that this build is overall a lot worse than the Tornado Druid build, but the AoE potential is very good. I think this ends up being behind Flurry, behind Tornado Druid, and ends up in the lower part of B tier. I'm going to drop the Thorns Barb down to C tier. Yeah, overall it's pretty solid. You have the double hit of Tramples plus Slide. The only thing is you kind of want gear to get your cooldown reduction in order to perma trample, which is pretty important in order to clear enemies really quickly. But if you do end up getting that, it's actually really solid for the AoE potential, and even could climb higher than potentially Tornado Druid in a lot of scenarios. Chain Lightning, or Lightning Storm rather, not Chain Lightning. Lightning Storm Druid. I've been very impressed with Lightning Storm Druid. It's either top of A tier or S tier. Lightning Storm Druid has been extremely, extremely good, and something that I've been very, very surprised by, because Lightning Storm was not on my radar for quite some time. But with the season 1, I've seen a lot of people roll out the Lightning Storm and just absolutely wreck AoE packs extremely quickly, and actually have some pretty decent movement speed to go along. I think the real strength of this build is just the amount of AoE damage potential, which isn't really comparable to a lot of the other builds on the list. But something that might be holding it back is a little bit of the mobility compared to Twisting Blades. And I'm looking at this list and I'm starting to think that I might need a couple of extra S tier builds here, or push some builds into the S tier. Because lastly, we have the Shred Druid. And you have a couple of options with this. You have like the lightning version, the poison version, you have all that different stuff. But actually Shred is very, very good. And I'm going to put it ahead of Whirlwind, slightly behind Death Trap here. I think that Shred just ends up being extremely powerful, even with the nerfs to a lot of the lightning options with Shred. But based on kind of the experience I've had with Shred, it is absolutely amazing. Really, really high mobility version of the Druid builds, which is pretty solid. And the nice thing is your damage reduction and things like keeping you alive are very strong with the Lightning Shred Druid. Poison version, a lot worse. Let's just say that. So ending it off here with my overall thoughts, and it might be a few changes to the list. I think that actually Bone Spear and potentially even Death Trap end up in the S tier. I think you could move up Pulverize into the A tier, potentially move Rapid Fire, but I think it's a little bit better than Double Swing. I think overall this is probably a good shakeup of the options. What you'll notice here is that Rogue have 2 builds in the S tier. Druid has 1 build in the S tier, 1 build in the A tier. And that just goes to show you that I think that the Druid and Rogue are going to dominate the speed clearing in this game when you're talking about the starter options for you in Season 1. I think that as you start to push Nightmare Dungeons, the Rogue is going to fall off, but still probably be around the A tier options. It's really when you start pushing, though. And I'm not quite sure when we'll see that in terms of like when we get the new gear, how hard it is to actually push into those higher Nightmare tiers. because I did not re-level a rogue in the past 2 days from level 1 to level 70 into 80 into 90. I was just experimenting on my fully built rogue, and unfortunately, one thing that my fully built rogue has that my new character will not is the ability to completely spec into whatever paragon and upgraded glyphs that I want. And unfortunately, we'll see how much grinding it actually takes for the rogue to keep up when you actually get to the end game. However, guess what? Because the rogue is so excellent at speed clearing, they actually might not fall too far behind because they're just going to be clearing so much faster than everyone else. Same thing goes with the Druid. I think that the class that probably got shafted the most is Sorcerer. Previously, I might have put the Ice Shards build into S tier with just how much damage you're pumping out, but you have builds like Firewall, Arc Lash, that are, good, decent, but, Arc Lash at least ends up being a little bit weaker as you start to dive into World Tier 4, a little bit slower with Firewall. Things like Whirlwind Barb were just absolutely like double S tier, amazing. But now I think they've fallen off quite a bit since the continuous nerfs of Whirlwind and Barb in general, but also the bug fixes that they tended to do. And also the Necromancer. Interesting that Necromancer Bone Spear still ends up in a very strong place. I think Bone Spear ends up being very, very solid still, especially with the just straight up ability to just how much damage you can do. It still has a lot of the crit damage multipliers, and guess what? Because the game removed a lot of your crit damage accessibility, the classes that have options to get more crit damage are even more valuable, and that's where Bone Spear comes in. But Necromancer also got shafted pretty hard with 2 builds in D tier and 2 of 3 builds in D tier. And then also the other options being pretty mediocre, like Sever. I guess Infinite Mist is pretty solid. And lastly, just to talk a little bit more about, the overall look of the game. I think that in general, again, Rogue and Druids are going to be really speed clearing a lot quicker. And as you start to approach endgame, I think Sorcerer is just going to struggle so much. I think Necromancer is going to drop off quite a bit as well compared to what it was before, because before you just powerhouse your way through, you didn't need to worry too much about a lot of other things. And I think that realistically Druid is going to be the big heavy hitter overall, but we'll see. And who knows, maybe I will see a lot of the options with the hearts and things will change, because those things have not been tested really at all yet, and those things could change because there are really good options for a lot of the classes when we consider those. And so when we start to find builds that do incorporate them and do so well, then we're going to find that, well, this list may change as we approach, and I'm sure it will as we approach deeper into season 1. But hopefully this is going to be a good option for you all to kind of follow. You can look up a lot of the options that I mentioned, like Bone Spear Necromancer. There's a ton of good builds out there for that. Death Trap Rogue, Lightning Storm Druid, etc. You can find all of these builds across like Icy Veins, Max Roll, YouTubers out there. I even have a couple builds on like Bone Spear, Twisting Blades, although those builds are probably a little bit different now. So, you'll probably find some option there, and hopefully this will help you kind of grind through season 1. Also, if you haven't already, click on the link in the description down below. Check out that insane Diablo PC. I think it's pretty cool, and probably a once-in-a-lifetime thing to possibly get. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all for the next one.